On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sonjoy Roy, and all of us at Teamwork Arts, I welcome you to this session of JLF Words Are Bridges. Words Are Bridges celebrates the indomitable spirit, diversity, and richness of languages, Indian and international. In this series, we showcase an original work, the translation of the same, and an insight into the author's unique world. This series reinforces our vision to ensure the free flow of knowledge, information, and ideas. Today we present Khwabnama, Arunava Sinha in conversation with Rakhshanda Jalil. The late Bangladeshi writer Akhtaruzzman Elias's novel Khwabnama weaves a tapestry of magical realism, blending dreams and memory, legend and history with the struggle of marginalised people and the stories of their ancestors. Translated from Bangla to English by Arunava Sinha, the narrative is set in the time of the Tebhaga Movement within Bengal in the 1940s and explores the hopes and aspirations of a farmer as he cultivates his land. In conversation with literary historian, author, and translator Rakhshanda Jalil, Arunava discusses the nuances of translating a text so heavily steeped in history and the essence of land as a harbinger of hope and the future. Arunava Sinha translates classic, modern, and contemporary Bengali fiction and non-fiction from Bangladesh and India into English. Over 60 of his translations have been published so far. His recent translations include Taslima Nasrin's Shameless, Manda Devi's An Educated Woman in Prostitution, the anthology Desire for Fire, Modern Bengali Poetry in Translation, and Akhtaruzzman Elias's Khwabnama. Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil is a multi-award-winning translator, writer, and literary historian. She's published over 25 books and written over 50 academic papers and essays. Some of her books include Liking Progress, Loving Change, a literary history of the progressive writers movement in Urdu, a biography of Urdu feminist writer Dr. Rashid Jahan, A Rebel and Her Cause, a translation of The Sea Lies Ahead, Intizar Hussein's seminal novel on Karachi, and Krishan Chandar's partition novel, Gadar, among others. She runs an organization called Hindustani Awaz, devoted to the popularization of Hindi, Urdu literature and culture. We're delighted to welcome our wonderful speakers for today. And now let's begin our session. Khwabnama, Arunava Sinha in conversation with Rakhshanda Jalil.
Hi, Arunava. Always a pleasure to talk to you. First of all, many congratulations on this splendid new book. But tell me, is this your 656th book, or do I have my numbers wrong?
Sometimes this book made me feel like it was about 500 books packed into one. So maybe you're close to the mark. It's a fat book. It's also a book that you feel like it was written in one frenzied haze from start to finish. You know, there's a momentum and energy about the prose, and you can't let go of it. But while a writer can perhaps do that, for a translator who also has to live a life outside of the book they're translating, it's a very difficult and strange but wonderful experience.
But I'm not going to let you wriggle out of this question, Arunava. Tell me, with this book, the tally comes to what?
The tally
How many published books?
Okay, so the number of published books, I think, is 61. And there are about 7 or 8 lying with publishers right now, which will come out.
Such an inspiration for this growing breed of translators in India, and wishing you more power, more success.
Thank you. But I'm also, I think both you and I are very delighted at the growing breed that you mentioned.
Absolutely.
Amazingly good translators.
Yes. And rightly so. In a country as multilingual as ours, what will we not do if we don't work with translations? So it's very appropriate that we have this many, and people are making a space for it. Booksellers are, book editors are, book review editors are, which is all very good. Now let's talk about this, your newest book. It's a big book, and as you said, you have a life outside of translation. You teach at the Ashoka University, but with a 550-page book, is this something you work on ceaselessly, as in one project at a time, or is this something you juggle with other things?
No, while I was doing this book, I focused on this one alone, and I did the bulk of it during the summer vacation from my university 2 years ago. So that also allowed me a little more of time during the day than I normally would have. And it's 190,000 words. And quite frankly, when you're translating, sometimes you feel, although you love translating, you sometimes feel you will never finish.
Yes, I know.
And there was a time when I honestly told my friends, either this book will make it or I will make it. I don't think both of us will survive.
Yeah.
But here we are.
I've had that experience where I've abandoned one particular text by my favorite author, Hussain, because it just becomes overwhelming.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about, I don't wish to give the story away, but we do need to talk a little about the context because that's very, very interesting. It's written in the 1940s. The great famines, the great man-made famines of Bengal are just behind us. The earth is ready and plentiful and willing to give of itself to those who are willing to work hard to, work on that very fertile land. You have your main character is a sharecropper. It is set against the background of the Tebhaga movement, where sharecroppers are earlier, most half of the produce would go to the zamindars, the landowners, but these sharecroppers are saying that it should be 1/3. And this is the political background. And of course, there are many other strands. Could you briefly tell us a little about this? And also, is there anything like this in Bangla literature? Are there others that were sort of something similar that you might have read in Bangla?
Right. So yes, this is set in just before and after the independence of India and the partition in the mid-1940s. And it is set in what is now northern Bangladesh, at that point, an area to the north of Bengal. And it is set, as you said, there are multiple backdrops. There is, of course, the farmers' movement, the Tebhaga movement, where the croppers actually want 2/3 of the produce. And then there is the movement towards independence and, more importantly, perhaps partition, which is foregrounded rather than independence in certain parts of the country and over here as well. Which would have just lent itself to a historico-political novel, perhaps. But what Akhtaruzzman Elias does is that he places this in a stream of similar battles for personal and tribal freedom across over history. And all those old battles keep reappearing as dreams and memories in the minds, and folk tales and songs that are heard over and over again. And somehow that history gets imbued with the mystical quality of being able to foretell the future and indeed explain the world and the universe. So it is very much in demand. So at all points, there is this battle for precious resources, and there is hunger. As you said, it comes as the famine has ended, but Tamiz is, of course, the central character of the novel, desperately looking for a plot of land, and his needs are simple. He is not very, they're not very nuanced. He's not very politically active or aware of everything. All he wants really is a plot of land that he can cultivate, and he's willing to give it everything, all his strength, in order to produce a good harvest. But his father is perhaps the more interesting character, and his father does not have a name. He's just called Tamizer Bap in the Bangla. And Tamizer Bap is characterized by an endless hunger. He can eat absolutely any amount. He can, the other thing he does is he can work incredibly hard if given the opportunity, and he can sleep. And even in his sleep, he walks. And he walks in search of something from the mythical, historical past, which he thinks will redeem him in some strange way. So he represents so many things about the people to whom, he belongs to the class of Majis or fishermen, but he represents so many things about the aspirations and simple needs, everything from the physical to the perhaps even quasi-spiritual needs of the people. And so the whole thing acquires this grand mythical proportion. The novel becomes this grand exposition of all these ideas, which is unparalleled in Bangla literature. So while similar novels have been written from a political context or a historical context, never before have all these elements come together in a single grand telling. In fact, you can tell how big it was for the writer, in that Akhtaruzzman Elias wrote only 2 novels in his entire life. Just 2. His first one was Chilekota Shepai, the soldier in the attic, which put a very different spin on the freedom movement of Bangladesh. And then this one. And there's the story is not story. The truth is that he was diagnosed with cancer before he had finished this novel, and he actually went to Calcutta to be treated, and they had to amputate a leg. So he spent the last days of his life without a leg and furiously finishing this novel. It was almost like he would not die till he had finished the novel.
Yeah. No, we'll come to Akhtaruzzman Elias and his work in a bit, but I also want to talk a little more about the technique used here. We think of Salman Rushdie and Midnight's Children that opened a floodgate of magic realism in India, and that's when we began to associate, magic realism as a technique for writing novels which mix the past and the present, and the past is, sort of constantly there in the present, and the use of mythology and dreams and so on. But here you have this novel also, in a sense, using elements of magic realism. Is this also something that you have found in other Bangla literature, or is this something you associate with this novel?
Not too many. There are a few here and there, but to be honest, many of them I've felt like mechanical attempts to introduce the idea of magical realism. But this one does it quite seamlessly, unobtrusively. Unobtrusively. It's not in your face. It's not saying, look at me, I am magically realist. But the way the characters and the events move so smoothly from the realm of what your senses can actually absorb to what you can only imagine is you don't even know. Sometimes you don't even realize that the transition has taken place.
And maybe the landscape is such, the land and water merge so seamlessly. Land, water, sky seem to come together without boundaries. So I think that lends itself so nicely, the way the landscape is described, at least the way it comes across in your translation. I was wondering if there is a passage about what we are talking about that you might want to read out for us. And then we'll come to Akhtaruzzman.
All right. I'll read a passage which may not directly bring out what we are talking about, but it's nevertheless something that I find quite, it led me very deeply into the novel. So I'm just going to read that. This is the beginning of chapter 2. When hunger jabbed open Kulsum's eyes, she noticed that one side of the door was wide open. Tamiz's father had left a muddy footprint on the doorstep. Had a kick from the same foot opened the door? How could that be possible? The foot wasn't strong enough. He was lying on the floor, so the man had obviously been outside at night, which meant that the swamp of Katlahar had sucked out at least a little bit of blood from his feet. It was doubtful whether he would be able to walk before it was afternoon. His numb right foot lay near the side of the door that was still shut. His faded lungi was hoisted halfway up his legs, though the garment was not in its place. A long time ago, when Tamiz's mother ran the household, a Mural had bitten off an ounce of flesh from his thigh one new moon night when he entered the waters of Katlahar Lake. With his lungi raised, the scar was visible now. Below it was the inflamed wound from about a year ago, earned when he was stabbed by a fishing hook. Tamiz's father had been fishing beneath the sandpaper tree at Fakir's Ghat. When a huge catfish was caught on the hook, he tugged hard at the rod. The hook flew out of the water, the catfish still attached to it, and struck him on the knee, impaling itself in his flesh while the fish was flung upwards to a low branch of the tree. The fish was never found, nor did Tamiz's father discover any sign that it had returned to the lake. Whose signal had it responded to then to launch itself out of the water and perform the maneuver that had ensured his wound had not healed yet? The scar from the bite of the Mural from the time when Tamiz's mother was alive and the recent wound from the fishing hook remained adjacent nevertheless. The wound kept spreading, threatening to encroach on the scar from the Mural bite at any moment. But having reached the edge, the bloody thing refused to advance, showing no signs of climbing further. But it did not heal either, the pus making it swell without allowing it to grow sideways. The mud stains persisted beneath the knee. A little higher and the moist tang of Katlahar Lake would have combined with the fish-like stench of the wound to create a completely different smell, one that was very familiar to Kulsum. When she sniffed deeply, wrinkling the nose on which she had still managed to preserve the stud she wore, her nostrils were beset, along with a slightly moist, slightly stale, and slightly fish-like smell of the lake, with a lighter scent. A scent of what? Clambering up on the macha, the rough-hewn platform of bamboo logs attached halfway up the wall, Kulsum threw a glance to her left and another to her right. Finding her bearings with the help of the scent, she discovered the object. What was it then? Nothing but crumpled and torn lily petals peeping out from beneath Tamiz's father's coal-black bony frame. Along with her nose, Kulsum's entire belly and breast were now pressed into service for sniffing. She made the inhaled air circulate through the length of her body, turning even her short and medium breaths into a single long one, which could actually be called a sigh. If the sigh were to be passed through a strainer, the words that would emerge would be something like this. If only the old coot had picked some lily stems. What then? Then Kulsum would have cooked a delicious dry dish with them, added chilies and some diced garlic pods. When she made this dish, Tamiza's father gobbled up 3 platefuls of rice with it, with some roasted chilies on the side. Waking up late in the morning after trudging all the night through the mud and water, he could consume an enormous quantity of rice. Where did the old fellow stow away so much food in that scrawny body of his?
Thank you, Arunava. Let's talk of some of the other, the cross currents that ripple through the narrative. There is the freedom struggle, of course, but there's also the creation of of Pakistan, and of families, of villages being divided by newly demarcated borders. There is the Muslim League, which is also active. So tell us a little about the political aspects of this. And was there anything that troubled you in particular?
Well, no. I mean, I think in a sense, this novel, we are all as Bengalis and having been brought up on a diet of stories from the partition days and the days of violence. I think we in this part of the border, on this part of the border, have really grown up with certain stories told from a certain singular perspective, which always had to do with the other side being the bad guys and our side being the good guys and we being the victims and so on. So, in a sense, I think it is useful and indeed necessary to.
If I may interrupt you, also how our losses were more than the other sides.
Exactly.
That also comes out in a singular narrative.
Yeah, and then in the recent few past, of course, there's been other narrative strains piled on top of those to suggest other stories and the emergence of other saviors.
Yeah.
But leaving that aside. So this story is actually, I think, places the acts of difference and violence in a much more, hard to say placing violence in a human way, but it does that in some strange way. You are able to see through the eyes of the people who are both being violent and at the receiving end of the violence. And you can also see that the big picture is not really important to them. At that point, they're just dealing with their local, the violence at the orchestrated at the larger political level gets converted into a local battle for survival and for resources. So this novel really shows us in those scenes how the two merge into one, and at some point you no longer know where it's a class struggle, where it's a caste struggle, and where it's a religious or a communal conflict. The three have become one, and also the ease, the sort of what you feel helpless at is the acceptance of this. That there is this awareness right through that the conflict is bound to happen because there are all these differences we know, which are interestingly at the level of the individuals it does not exist. But the moment the individuals are exposed to the political talk, they become aware of it and they suddenly realize that yes, this is something that is inevitable. And so there is this great in the classic Greek tragedy sense, the inevitability of it all. There's no individual acts of heroism or group acts of heroism that can prevent it. Yeah. So that happens. But it is also very much about survival beyond that, but survival not in a sort of, we are all brothers and sisters kind of way, but survival in a very practical kind of way, that life must go on even for those who have lost some of their limbs, and some people will die. So the acceptance of death also comes through very strongly here. And of course, some people, they persist beyond their death. As we see, they persist either as imagined spirits, and at no point does the author say that they're ghosts. Yeah. So they are spirits in the perception of the people around them. Yeah. And they live on in history, most important. They live on in history in the collective consciousness as historical figures who, it is believed, continue to live and intervene in the lives of the people. So it is a giant kind of fabric where all these things are woven together, so that nothing is foregrounded, nothing stands out, but you realize that life was so much a complicated combination of all of these things.
The violence that you allude to, of course, it's communal violence in some cases, especially with the country being divided and so on. But I think there's also violence within same groups, same people of the same religion. The Jatidars, for example, and the sharecroppers, they could also all be from the same community or caste or religious grouping.
That's right.
And yet there is violence there as well. So
Yeah.
it's interesting how the land is pitting people against people, and it is, also, we haven't talked really of the Communist Party of India, which had a major role in the Tebhaga movement.
That's right.
How to bring that in?
So that's very much it's referenced, as they say. You can see that the Communist Party is running its own movement in order to enable the farmers to have their rights. And very interestingly, the proponents of the new state of Pakistan, of the formation of Pakistan, are saying that all of this will be a given in Pakistan because there will be no zamindari, there will be no feudal land owners, and the people will own the land. So in a sense, it's a very communist vision, very interestingly, that the champions
They've already announced the act which will abolish this. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And of course, it turns out that it does not happen.
Yeah.
It is never passed, and therefore life continues the way it was. But you can also see that when the communists come into play, you can immediately see the entrenched political forces, including the Congress Party and others, who are actually opposed to the communists because they know very well that if the communists are successful, people will completely go over to their side and they will no longer have any influence over them. So they try to use these storytellers and these minstrels in order to sway people, so very much the power of the word from the podium. You can see that it is very keenly felt and recognized, and the powers that be try to use them. So much so that one of the characters actually has made it his mission to try and get hold of the manuscript, in which he expects to find all those old magical lyrics that Chirag Ali, who is Kulsum's grandfather, the Kulsum I mentioned, who's Tamiz's father's second wife. Yeah. So she's not Tamiz's mother, a biological mother. So Chirag Ali actually had this book, and he was the one who used to be the minstrel who would sing, go everywhere, and people loved him. And therefore, that book is called Khwabnama. So that book is the one that is supposed to hold all the secrets and everything. So there is also this sense that it is, and somewhere you start thinking it's a fraud. I mean, it's not really a book that has anything. It was something Chirag Ali was also using in order to get going with his career as a wandering minstrel who could supposedly interpret dreams. But it's not really anything like that. So
yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little now of Akhtaruzzman Elias. You mentioned earlier on that he's written actually only 2 novels, and yet he has this prominent position in the pantheon of Bangla writers. When I read this book in translation, I'm struck by a couple of things linguistically, and maybe you can throw some more light on it as to how it reads in Bangla. There are long sentences interspersed with shorter ones. The long sentences I know are from Indian languages to English are a killer to translate, because the tense kind of, is all over the place, and our Bhasha writers somehow get away with that fluctuating tense, but English demands a constant, tense. Is it now? Is it later? Is it in the future? The reader wants to know. So tell us something that challenged you in this book, as you have possibly not been challenged before, something that is unique to Akhtaruzzman Elias's style of writing.
Yes, well, several things. One, of course, as you mentioned, is the length of the sentences. And because despite the length of the sentences, they still hold the cogency and the clarity of thought that his writing always had. So, you almost think that he wrote them in one flow. But as a translator, it is impossible to translate it in one flow. So you deconstruct it, you break it down, you translate each bit, and then you bring it back together, and then read it 50 times to see, okay, is this saying the same thing that is it the same sentence, essentially, in every sense, both in terms of the basic level of meaning, as well as the sounds, the music, the pauses, the silences, the complexity, the magic.
And the grammar that goes for a toss.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing about the grammar, of course, as you mentioned, tenses, is that, and this Bangla does it very well, so do other non-English Indian languages, which is that you slip, as you said, from verbs that denote the past tense to verbs that denote the present tense. And yet, when you're reading, it's very clear it's still in the past tense. Yeah. There's no confusion there. So it's lovely how suddenly the narrator actually places themselves right in the action, instead of recounting it from a distance in time to say,
I was there, I saw it.
Yes, I'm seeing it. Yeah. Not just I saw it, but I'm seeing it. As I'm telling you, I'm seeing it. This is happening. So it's glorious. And Rakhshanda, actually, I've recently started translating into Bangla as well. And I discovered that it is a very powerful tool. Very often when in English, what sounds a little mechanical can become very fluid when you quickly move it to present tense verbs. While keeping the action in the past.
Are you translating into Bangla?
I've just finished translating Amitabh Ghosh's Gun Island, which is in the press now. Before that, that was directly from the English. Before that, I worked on Punachi, where I used both the English and the Hindi translations for the English version, for the Bangla version. And a couple of years ago, I'd done Vivek Shanbag's Ghachar Gochar as well, again using the English and the Hindi versions. So I really found that and especially, I think Vivek is perhaps his writing is also informed by Western modes and forms, but Perumal Mohan's writing is so not influenced by Western modes that it's very fascinating how you can move it around very felicitously between the past and present and verbs, and it all falls into place beautifully.
Yeah. But a bilingual translator, I mean, that's really something. But I think I interrupted you when you were still talking about Akhtaruzzman and the linguistic.
Yes.
Could you talk
So the length of the sentences and complexity, that was one. The second was, of course, the dialogue, because the dialogue is all in the local version of the Bangla language, which was spoken in that area. Well, most of it. When the action shifts to the big cities and so on, no, then it's more of the urban kind. And really, this is an old problem we have. And I have never found an adequate answer to how to move a variation of the standard version into English without making it look like a caricature or some kind of artificially chosen accent. I mean, I'm not even capable of it. I think if for some mad reason one morning I decided that I would make people speak in Cockney or Scottish or say in Harlem.
Mate for them, like instead of or yard.
Yeah. I wouldn't be able to pull it off. And I'd get so constrained by the need to stick to that form that the content would go for a toss completely. And then what sense does it make if to readers you suddenly give them an accent or a way of speaking that is familiar to them from an entirely different geography? They're likely to be very confused. Why are people who lived in the north of Bengal in 1946 speaking with a Cockney brogue? It makes no sense, right? So just in order to create that sense of distance, I found it difficult. So I didn't try. Eventually, I said, look, when people are talking to one another, they understand one another perfectly, right? No matter what language they're using. They have no difficulty understanding each other. So why should I make the reader go through this experience? Nor even Akhtaruzzman Elias, when he used that version, it wasn't to make his readers feel alienated. His readers in Bangladesh knew. They could understand what they were reading. Their ears were used to different variations. So if I'm going to be...
Pardon my ignorance, but is his register very different from what is standard Bangla, or is there no standard Bangla?
No, the standard Bangla is the urbanized Bangla of officialdom and writing. Indeed, Bangla literature that came from Calcutta and its surroundings has always, in fact, there has been not too much change in 100 years. If you read some of the things that Manik Bandyopadhyay particularly wrote in the 1930s or 40s, you will see the Bangla today not very different, although it has acquired a lot more from other modes of other forms over the past 10 years or so, thanks to the internet. But before that, not very different. Whereas the literature that came out of East Bengal, as it's called, and then subsequently it became East Pakistan and then Bangladesh, has always had another version of Bangla, but neither is the standard Bangla, because honestly, both sides laugh at the other one and they say, you speak very strange Bangla. And the other say, no, you guys speak very strange Bangla. We speak the standard one.
I heard even street, people who were street hawkers, you could tell from their cries whether they'd come from the other side, because,
Yes, and it is very unfortunate that in the West Bengal, there is the East Bengal version of Bangla is associated with a poorer quality and with less of education and less of social position and so on, which is absolute bunkum. Yeah. Because, it is a version which is spoken by everybody cutting across class lines and economic lines. So, a word, we will, for simple words, like we'll say, khabe, will you eat? And a person in Dhaka will say, khaba. Will you eat? Yeah, but in Calcutta, somehow anyone who says khaba will immediately be associated with a country yokel, doesn't get the language. It's nonsense, right? So I also didn't want to create that sense of distinction by creating a better, a higher form and a lower form of English in any way, and give the impression that
you chose not to use a pidgin English for
exactly. So I was led by the text. I felt that over and above the vocabulary, which is slightly different, and the pronunciation, which is slightly different, there will also be a rhythm of speech and the way the sentences are constructed and so on that might be unique to these people. So if instead of trying to mechanically construct a version, if I just follow the text very closely and try to do that in English. So if it's shorter sentences, I'll do shorter sentences. If it's differently, if the syntax is slightly different, I'll see if I can do a slightly different syntax and yet not make it weird, and so on. But on the whole, the attempt was at letting readers feel that a normal conversation is taking place among the people. But it is still difficult because, there are words you don't know. And there are lot of words that you don't know. So I acquired a great dictionary of regional Bangladesh, from regions of Bangladesh, which was very useful. I also had to keep getting in touch with friends, yes, and asking them. And even after I had finished, a couple of people who read some parts of the manuscript corrected some of my mistakes. Because sometimes a word has two different meanings in two parts of Bengal, and you don't realize that. Yeah. For example, there's a word, chal, which not the rice chal, but the roof chal, which in our part of the world refers to the roof, but in Bangladesh, no, khol, not chal. It refers to the yard. And what I'd done, it's a minor thing, it may not even have mattered, but the fact is that I translated as the birds came and settled on the roof. And the truth is that they came and settled in the yard, not on the roof. Now, to a reader in the larger scheme of things might make any difference. But you pile on this, and eventually, it's not a great thing. So, yeah.
Okay, just out of curiosity, was there something that you found completely untranslatable and you chose to let it stay? Because this is something I have started doing, and it's not a shortcut. It's a conscious decision that, okay, I'm throwing up my hands and I really don't want to translate this word. I want to let this word be there in the English and let the reader figure it out, Were there any instances where you came across a word which you said, look, I can't find an equivalent for this?
Yeah. No, I did. For example, matcha, which I used in the passage that I read, which is this, this structure that you have halfway up the wall.
The mark.
So it creates another level in a room where you only, in a hut where you have only one room. So it serves both as a storage place and as a place. It's a loft. But if you use the word loft, then it's going to create a very Western connotation, and people will visualize it differently. And I didn't want that to happen. I mean, with the wild hope that this book might go out to other countries and readers elsewhere, because it really, no matter who translates this book, it deserves to be read by everybody around the world. So, and I stuck to matcha, and I did gloss an explanation in the text, to be honest, very surreptitiously, hoping that it would not stand out too much. And I've done that in one or two places. Elsewhere, I've let it be. I mean, the context reveals the meaning, and it carries a certain, it might provoke you to go and find out more in the age of the internet. That's the easiest thing under the sun. And increasingly, we realize that we don't want to domesticate the translation for the readers in another land, because they should, indeed, if they are visiting Bangladesh, or at that point, East Pakistan or undivided India, then they should not feel that it is their own country. They should genuinely feel that it's a different space and a different time.
I agree totally. I also resist this impulse to infantilize the reader or the content, that you don't have to really make everything idiot-proof, as it were. What are you working on now, Arunava?
Okay, so I've just finished another mammoth novel by a Bangladeshi writer, his first novel, Masroor Arifin. It's called Phantoms of August. It is the most remarkable novel, and I have no idea if it will ever find a publisher. But it was one of those books that I felt I really wanted write in English, as it were. It's a very postmodern novel, 160,000. One guy who is obsessed with the assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in 1975, and who in some strange way wants to avenge that assassination. And it's a meditation, again, on violence. It's a meditation on violence in human beings in all manner around the world, but primarily in history and in 1975, 15th of August, as it happens. which is an important date for us. On the 15th of August 1975, he and his entire family were butchered in their own homes. It goes on to create a new act of violence, a new strange thing. It drifts into surreal territory, and it reminded me very much, and it's full of literary allusions of Proust and Lermontov and Pushkin and Kafka. And it reminded me in some strange way of Nausgard, which is that, it's compelling. You can't stop reading, even though nothing much is happening in that sense. And the narrator is also quite an unlikable person. He's not a nice guy by any stretch of the, in an irritating way. I mean, he's not a villain bad guy. He's just a guy you would normally avoid in real life, or you don't want to be friends with. So, but yet you're compelled to listen to what they're saying. So, it was a very strange. So I've just finished that, and we will go and shop for publishers for it. I'm currently translating a novel named Narach from Bangla, which is a historical novel set in the late 19th century. It is very much a caste and gender driven novel, which also has as its backdrop the practice of sending indentured labor to the Caribbean and other countries on ships. So, the Girmitiyas, which Amitav Ghosh has also written about. So there is this family of Brahmins who have been recruited with they think that they're going to a wonderful place for 5 years to make lots of money and live a great life. But as it happens, they're being ostracized from their village because of various things that have happened to their family, and the village elders have decided that they don't deserve to live in the village anymore. And so it's a saga of exploitation, but you also have a larger canvas in that it is the time when Wajid Ali Shah has been exiled to Mitiaburus in Calcutta. So he's come to live there, and all these historical lines intersect. So there is exploitation, Brahmanism. There is tremendous, there is this story that if as a man you do not have a son, then you are going to go to a certain hell, Punnam Narak. Apparently
a separate hell for people.
No, I mean, there are hells. Apparently hell has many segments, depending on the sins that have brought you there. So this one is not even a sin. You've just not had a son. But apparently it's not okay not to have a son. So naturally, and you're getting old, right? And you can no longer have children, leave alone a son. So that immediately raised the opportunity for this bunch of other people to come and say, oh, we'll fix it all for you. We'll do these grand rituals, which will ensure you have a son. You have to marry this girl, this young girl, this very nubile girl. And of course, you know who is going to impregnate the nubile girl. It is not going to be the legally wedded husband. It is going to be one of those other men. So a whole racket was going on along these lines. So, sexual exploitation has such brilliant works, a framing of the imagination to go with it. I mean, I shouldn't laugh. It was horrible. Truly horrible. So that is foregrounded in this novel in the narrative in a very interesting way.
Yeah. Okay, listening to you, I'm very tempted to ask this. What draws you to a book? And have you ever translated or embarked upon a translation that you find that you absolutely hate and you don't want to do this? Not because of its length or something like that, but ideologically or somewhere as a reader, it puts you off. What do you do then?
Yeah. No, that's great. That's a great question. What draws me to a book is I'm a reader like everybody else. And, you like different books, various books for various reasons. For various virtues have I loved various women, I think Ferdinand said. Yeah, and which we would always quietly change when we enacted it to vices. On stage we would go up and read it as for various vices have I loved various women. But yeah, but that's an interesting point, because I am drawn to a book by its angularities, not only by how beautiful it is, but also by all the strangeness in it, and increasingly also how much it comes from the margins, how much it talks about things that have not been talked about. Messy. I mean, I like messiness. Earlier I used to like finished books like good literature students, but increasingly I'm veering towards messiness in books where there is vastness, there is grandness, but there's also so many elements that the reader has to actually sit and redo the book in their head, and not necessarily have it perfectly laid out. I mean, you have to cook the book. Not the books, the book. The ingredients are there, but the reader has to cook it rather than have it completely plated for them and where you just eat it. And the other question I have sometimes just been eventually put off by the prose or by some ideas in the book but nothing so excessively that has forced me to say I can't do this, I'm abandoning this and so on. That has not happened yet. Maybe because and it's not as though I read every book before I translate it. Sometimes I don't, and I found that quite a useful method actually. So sometimes it is a leap of faith, but it's a combination. I mean, morning shows the day. You read a few pages and you know that this book perhaps is not going to venture into some kind of territory that will be absolutely abhorrent. And then you know a little bit about the writer, and maybe you read a review or two. Sometimes you have a chat with the writer if possible. I certainly now try to have a chat with the writer to understand their politics, because sometimes you never know. There are people who've written books 10 years ago whose politics has now become of a very different color.
Yes.
And like it or not, I'm not going to translate their book, even if it's a wonderful book.
Yeah. And you are blessed that in Bangla, the language that you translate from, there is such an eclectic range of genres, of ideas, of topics, and you translate poetry as well. So it's not as though you're confined to just prose. So that is fabulous. And I think we're coming to the end of our time today. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Arunava. Wishing you all the very best, and wishing this book all the very best, because here's a book that is looking out for a prize. It deserves it. And I hope people watch out for this book. The powers that be who sit on various juries need to watch out for this book. This is a splendid, splendid book. Thank you so much, Arunava.
Thank you, Rakhshanda. It was really lovely talking to you.
Good talking to you.
Thank you, Arunava and Rakhshanda, for that wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking us through the nuances of translation. I hope all of you watching will go and buy a copy of the book and read it. On behalf of all of us, please stay safe, stay masked, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday, 19th August, with our next session. Good night and take care.